In the twilight of the 11th century, a fervent cry echoed across the fragmented kingdoms of Western Europe, a call that would irrevocably alter the course of history in the Levant and beyond. It was a sound born of spiritual zeal and political ambition, a resounding Deus Vult, God wills it, that ignited the First Crusade. Imagine the crisp autumn air of November 1095, in a field outside the city of Clermont in France, where Pope Urban II stood before a throng of clergy and nobles, painting a vivid, harrowing picture of Christian pilgrims suffering in the Holy Land and the sacred city of Jerusalem under Muslim rule. His words, amplified by the fervent beliefs of the era, promised spiritual rewards for those who took up the cross, a direct path to salvation, and perhaps, for many, the allure of adventure, land, and riches in a distant, fabled land. The response was immediate and overwhelming, a tidal wave of piety and opportunism. From the rugged hills of Normandy to the fertile plains of Flanders, from the sun-drenched vineyards of Provence to the forested valleys of Lorraine, men of all stations began to prepare. Knights, squires, foot soldiers, peasants, and even women and children, driven by a complex tapestry of faith, penance, and desperation, began their arduous journey eastward. This was not a unified army in the modern sense, but rather a collection of disparate forces, each led by powerful, often rivalrous European nobles. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman prince from southern Italy, and Robert Curthose, Duke of Normandy, brother of the King of England. These were some of the prominent figures who would lead their contingents across thousands of miles of unforgiving terrain. The journey itself was an epic of endurance and suffering. Many perished from starvation, disease, or skirmishes with hostile local populations. The People's Crusade, an earlier, less organized wave, led by Peter the Hermit, met a tragic end in Anatolia, largely annihilated by the Seljuk Turks. Yet the main Crusader armies, though depleted, pressed on. Their path took them through the Byzantine Empire, whose emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, viewed them with a mixture of hope and profound suspicion. He had initially sought mercenary aid against the Seljuks, not a vast, unruly host intent on conquering territories he still considered his own. The cultural and religious chasm between the Latin West and the Greek East was vast, leading to frequent misunderstandings and outright hostilities, even as they shared a common enemy. By 1097, the Crusaders had reached Anatolia, engaging in their first major siege at Nicaea, a Seljuk stronghold that eventually fell to the combined efforts of the Crusaders and the Byzantines. This victory, however, was followed by the brutal march across the Anatolian plateau, culminating in the harrowing siege of Antioch, a city of immense strategic importance. For nearly 8 months, from October 1097 to June 1098, the Crusaders endured unimaginable hardships outside Antioch's formidable walls. Famine, disease, and desertion plagued their ranks. Morale plummeted, and the very notion of divine favor seemed to wane. It was during this desperate period that a pivotal moment occurred: the alleged discovery of the Holy Lance within the city, a relic believed to have pierced Christ's side. Whether a genuine miracle or a brilliant piece of psychological warfare, the discovery reinvigorated the Crusaders, inspiring them to a renewed fervor that led to the city's eventual capture. The fall of Antioch was a brutal affair, marked by widespread slaughter, but it opened the path southward towards their ultimate goal, Jerusalem. Yet even after this hard-won victory, the Crusader leaders squabbled over who would control the newly conquered territories. Bohemond of Taranto, for instance, established the Principality of Antioch, while Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's bro, there carved out the county of Edessa further east. These nascent Crusader states, born of conquest, were the first seeds of what would become the Latin East. As the remaining Crusader forces, now significantly smaller but still fiercely determined, marched towards Jerusalem in the summer of 1099. The anticipation must have been palpable. The very air would have thrummed with the weight of their pilgrimage. On June 7, 1099, they finally sighted the walls of the Holy City, a moment that must have brought tears to the eyes of many who had endured so much. Jerusalem, then under the control of the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, was a heavily fortified city, its defenses formidable. The Crusaders, lacking siege engines and sufficient supplies, initially struggled. They built two massive siege towers, one led by Godfrey of Bouillon, the other by Raymond of Toulouse. From timber laboriously brought from afar, the final assault began on July 13th. For 2 days, the battle raged. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of unimaginable chaos and brutality. On July 15th, 1099, Godfrey's tower successfully breached the northern wall, and Crusader knights poured into the city. What followed was a horrific massacre. The chronicler Raymond of Aguilers, an eyewitness, chillingly recounted that men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were indiscriminately slaughtered, a stark and brutal testament to the ferocity of the conquest and the religious fervor that fueled it. The Dome of the Rock, a sacred Islamic shrine, was reportedly stripped of its gold, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque was desecrated. This brutal conquest, while achieving the Crusaders' primary objective, left an indelible scar on the city and its diverse populations, sowing seeds of resentment that would endure for centuries. With Jerusalem firmly in their hands, the Crusader leaders faced the monumental task of establishing a stable government in a hostile land. The question of who would rule the Holy City was paramount. Raymond of Toulouse, a powerful and pious figure, initially refused the crown, perhaps out of genuine humility, or perhaps due to political maneuvering. Ultimately, Godfrey of Bouillon was elected Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, defender of the Holy Sepulchre, rather than king, perhaps out of respect for Christ as the true king of Jerusalem. This choice reflected a desire to emphasize the city's sacred nature and the Crusaders' role as its protectors. Godfrey's reign, however, was brief. He died in 1100, just a year after the conquest, succumbing to illness. His successor was his brother, Baldwin of Boulogne, who had already established himself as Count of Edessa. Unlike Godfrey, Baldwin had no such compunctions about the title of king. He was crowned Baldwin I, King of Jerusalem, on Christmas Day 1100, in the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. This act officially marked the birth of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a Latin Christian entity in the heart of the Levant, surrounded by powerful Muslim neighbors. The early years of the Kingdom of Jerusalem were characterized by continuous warfare and expansion. Baldwin I proved to be a formidable military leader and an astute politician. He systematically worked to consolidate the kingdom's hold on the coastal cities, which were vital for trade and communication with Europe. Acre, Beirut, Sidon, and Tyre all fell to Crusader forces or their allies over the next 2 decades, often with the crucial support of Italian city-state navies from Genoa, Pisa, and Venice, who were eager to secure lucrative trading concessions. These port cities became the lifeblood of the kingdom, facilitating the arrival of new pilgrims, settlers, and vital supplies, as well as the export of local goods. The kingdom's territorial boundaries, however, were always fluid and contested. To the north lay the other Crusader states, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and later the County of Tripoli. While nominally allies and often bound by familial ties, these entities frequently acted independently and at times even in opposition to each other. Their very existence depended on a delicate balance of power with their Muslim neighbors, who, though initially fragmented, would eventually begin to coalesce. One of the unique features of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was its feudal structure, transplanted from Western Europe but adapted to the realities of the Levant. The king held supreme authority, but his power was balanced by a powerful high court composed of the kingdom's leading nobles, the great barons, who held vast fiefdoms. These barons, many of whom were original Crusaders or their descendants, owed military service to the king in exchange for their lands and privileges. This system, while familiar to the European knights, faced challenges in a land where Christian populations were a minority and where military threats were constant. The kingdom also saw the rise of the military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. These unique institutions, combining monastic vows with military prowess, became the backbone of the kingdom's defense. The Templars, founded around 1119 to protect pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem, quickly grew into a powerful and wealthy order, establishing a network of castles and commanderies across the Latin East and Europe. The Hospitallers, originally a charitable order caring for sick pilgrims, also militarized, becoming fierce warriors and building impressive fortresses. These orders, with their permanent, professional fighting forces, were indispensable to the kingdom's survival, often acting as the first line of defense against Muslim incursions. Their extensive landholdings and independent command structures, however, sometimes brought them into conflict with the secular nobility and even the king himself. Life within the Kingdom of Jerusalem was a fascinating blend of cultures. While the ruling class was Latin Christian, the vast majority of the population remained native Christians, Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Syriac, Muslims, and Jews. These communities, though often marginalized, continued to live under Crusader rule, maintaining their own customs, languages, and religious practices, albeit with certain restrictions and taxes. Historians still debate the true extent of cultural integration and interaction between the Franks, as the Crusaders were known, and the indigenous populations. Some argue for a degree of peaceful coexistence and cultural exchange, pointing to evidence of shared markets, legal systems, and even artistic influences. Others emphasize the inherent power imbalance and the constant underlying tensions between conquerors and conquered. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, a complex mosaic of interaction shaped by individual circumstances and the ever-present threat of conflict. The kingdom's economy was primarily agrarian, but trade played an increasingly vital role. The coastal cities, particularly Acre, became bustling international ports, connecting the markets of Europe with the riches of the East. Spices, silks, dyes, and other exotic goods flowed through these ports, generating immense wealth for the kingdom and its Italian merchant allies. Pilgrimage also remained a cornerstone of the economy and the kingdom's identity. Thousands of pilgrims continued to flock to the Holy Land each year, bringing with them wealth, labor, and a constant renewal of European interest and support. The early kings of Jerusalem, following Baldwin I, continued the work of consolidation and defense. Baldwin II, a cousin of Baldwin I, reigned from 1118 to 1131, facing numerous challenges, including his own capture by Muslim forces. Fulk of Anjou, who married Baldwin II's daughter Melisende and succeeded him in 1131, proved to be another strong ruler, expanding the kingdom's castle network and forging alliances. Melisende, a remarkable figure in her own right, wielded significant power as queen, particularly during the minority of her son, Baldwin III. Her reign, though sometimes fraught with internal strife, showcased the unique position of women in the Crusader states, who often held considerable influence and even ruled in their own right. Yet, despite these successes, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was always an anomaly, a vulnerable Latin outpost in a predominantly Muslim world. Its existence depended on a steady flow of manpower and resources from Europe, and on the continued disunity of its Muslim adversaries. The rise of powerful Muslim leaders, such as Zengi and later Saladin, would eventually pose an existential threat to the Crusader states, challenging their very foundations and leading to the eventual loss of Jerusalem itself. The initial fervor of Deus Vult had established the kingdom, but maintaining it would require constant vigilance, strategic alliances, and no small measure of luck. The very stones of the castles they built, like Carrick and Montreal, stood as defiant symbols of their presence, silent witnesses to the ongoing struggle for survival in a land steeped in history and holy significance. If you're enjoying this, liking and subscribing truly helps and is much appreciated. The dust had barely settled from the initial fervor of the First Crusade, yet the newly crowned Kingdom of Jerusalem, a fragile jewel in a hostile land, faced an immediate and profound challenge: survival. Godfrey of Bouillon, the first ruler, had humbly refused the title of king, preferring advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, a testament to the spiritual rather than temporal nature he envisioned for the nascent state. His reign, though brief, laid foundational stones, but it was his brother, Baldwin I, who would truly forge the kingdom into a recognizable entity, shaping its borders and securing its precarious existence through a blend of shrewd diplomacy and relentless military action. Baldwin, unlike Godfrey, harbored no such hesitations about the crown. Upon Godfrey's death, in July 1100, a swift and decisive struggle for succession ensued. Some advocated for a spiritual leader, perhaps a patriarch, to guide the kingdom, while others, more pragmatic, understood the dire need for a strong secular hand. Baldwin, then Count of Edessa, wasted no time. He rode south, a journey fraught with peril, his small retinue a testament to his audacity. His arrival in Jerusalem in November 1100 was met with a mixture of apprehension and relief. The clergy, notably the Patriarch Diambert, initially resisted his coronation, clinging to the ideal of a theocratic state. Yet the barons, then Count of Edessa, wasted no time. He rode south, a journey fraught with peril, his small retinue a testament to his audacity. Never one spiritual leader faltered and ever wrought with the bounty. Other aspects of the kingdom may have maintained interest among the clergy, but Baldwin never set a compromising policy, leading to a split between Godfrey and the Patriarch. Baldwin the Conqueror set the kingdom of Edessa in security, serving as a mediator of the Patriarch ruler. His reign, though brief, laid foundational stones, furthering the superior of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Baldwin, a barons, understood the dire need for a strong secular hand, shaping its borders and securing its precarious existence through a blend of shrewd recognizing the sheer necessity of a military leader in a land surrounded by enemies, prevailed. On Christmas Day, 1100, in the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, Baldwin was crowned the first king of Jerusalem, a title he embraced with the full weight of its temporal power. His kingship immediately brought a new dynamism. Baldwin was a man of action, a seasoned warrior with a keen strategic mind. He understood that the kingdom's survival depended not merely on holding Jerusalem, but on controlling the coastal cities, the vital arteries for supplies, reinforcements, and trade from Europe. The first years of his reign were a whirlwind of campaigns, each meticulously planned to chip away at the Muslim-held strongholds along the Levant coast. These cities, like Acre, Sidon, and Beirut, were not just ports, they were bastions of local power. Their capture, essential for consolidating Crusader control and establishing a secure line of communication with the West. One of Baldwin's earliest and most significant victories came in 1104 with the capture of Acre. This strategically vital port city, with its formidable double walls and natural harbor, had long resisted Crusader attempts. Baldwin, recognizing the need for naval support, forged an alliance with a Genoese fleet. The siege was arduous, marked by fierce resistance from the Fatimid garrison. Imagine the rhythmic thud of siege engines, the shouts of men, and the acrid smell of burning timber hanging heavy in the sea air. After weeks of relentless assault, the city finally fell, its capture opening a crucial gateway for pilgrims and merchants, transforming the kingdom's economic landscape. Acre would quickly become the primary port of the Crusader states, a bustling hub where East met West. Its markets overflowing with exotic goods, and its harbor crowded with ships bearing the flags of Genoa, Pisa, and Venice. Baldwin's campaigns were not isolated events. They were part of a grander strategy to create a defensible and economically viable kingdom. He understood the importance of securing the kingdom's flanks. To the south, he faced the constant threat of Fatimid incursions from Egypt. To counter this, he embarked on expeditions into the Negev desert, establishing a series of forts such as the formidable Montreal, Shobak in 1115. These desert castles, often built on high, desolate outcrops, served as watchtowers and garrisons, projecting Crusader power into the wilderness and protecting the pilgrimage routes to Sinai and Aqaba. The construction of Montreal, deep in what was then largely uncharted territory for the Franks, demonstrated Baldwin's foresight and his commitment to creating a buffer zone against Egyptian aggression. Perhaps these lonely desert fortresses, with their stark stone walls, whispered stories to the silent stars, tales of vigilant nights and the endless expanse of sand. To the north, the Crusader principalities of Antioch, Tripoli, and Edessa, though nominally allies, often pursued their own agendas. Baldwin, through a combination of diplomacy and military aid, sought to bind them more closely to Jerusalem, recognizing that a unified front was their only hope against the surrounding Muslim powers. He often rode north with his army to relieve besieged cities or to arbitrate disputes between the fractious Crusader lords, acting as a de facto overlord, even if his authority was sometimes begrudgingly acknowledged. Beyond military conquest, Baldwin was also a shrewd administrator. He understood that the kingdom needed more than just strong walls. It needed functioning institutions. He began the process of establishing a feudal system, parceling out lands to his loyal barons in exchange for military service, a familiar structure from their European homelands. This system, though adapted to the unique circumstances of the Levant, aimed to create a stable hierarchy and ensure a standing army for the kingdom's defense. He also recognized the importance of the indigenous Christian populations, the Syriacs, Armenians, and Greeks, who vastly outnumbered the Latin Franks. While the Franks held the reins of power, Baldwin generally pursued a policy of tolerance, allowing these communities to practice their faiths and maintain their own legal customs, a pragmatic approach that helped to maintain a semblance of peace within the diverse population. This policy, however, was not without its tensions, and the question of how much integration versus segregation truly occurred between the Latin conquerors and the local Christian populations remains a point of scholarly debate, with some historians emphasizing the enduring cultural divide, and others pointing to instances of cooperation and even intermarriage. Baldwin's reign also saw the formalization of the military orders, institutions that would become synonymous with the Crusader states, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. While the Hospitallers had existed as a charitable organization caring for pilgrims prior to the First Crusade, it was under Baldwin that they, along with the newly formed Templars, began to take on a significant military role. These warrior monks, bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, combined spiritual devotion with martial prowess. Becoming the elite fighting force of the kingdom, they were granted lands and castles, often in strategic border regions, and their white and red crosses would become a fearsome sight to their enemies. Imagine the glint of sun on their chainmail, the austere silence of their monastic lives, contrasted with the thunder of hooves on the battlefield. One lesser-known detail about Baldwin I's reign concerns his attempts to secure the southern trade routes. He was keenly aware of the economic importance of the Red Sea and the overland routes connecting Egypt with Damascus and beyond. In 1116, he led an expedition all the way to Aqaba on the Red Sea, a remarkable feat of endurance and logistics through harsh desert terrain. His aim was not to conquer Egypt, but to disrupt its trade and secure potential access to the lucrative spice routes. While he did not establish a permanent presence there, his expedition underscored his expansive vision for the kingdom, one that extended beyond the immediate coastal strip. It was a bold move, demonstrating a strategic understanding of economic warfare long before the term existed. Despite his successes, Baldwin's reign was not without its setbacks. He faced constant pressure from the Fatimids, the Seljuk Turks, and various local Muslim emirs. The sheer numerical superiority of his enemies meant that every victory was hard-won, and every defeat potentially catastrophic. He often had to ride at the head of his army, personally leading charges, a testament to the precariousness of his position and the constant need for a strong, visible leader. His campaigns were financially draining, and the kingdom, despite its coastal revenues, always struggled with resources. The constant need for reinforcements from Europe was a recurring theme, highlighting the kingdom's reliance on external support. Baldwin I died in 1118, returning from one of his campaigns in Egypt. He had led his forces deep into the Nile Delta, a bold but ultimately fruitless attempt to cripple Fatimid power. He fell ill near El Arish and, sensing his end, requested to be buried in Jerusalem. His body was transported back across the desert, a solemn procession under the vast, indifferent sky, to be laid to rest in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre alongside his brother Godfrey. His 12-year reign had been transformative. He had taken a collection of disparate conquests and, through relentless campaigning and shrewd political maneuvering, had forged them into a recognizable kingdom. The borders he established, the administrative structures he initiated, and the strategic alliances he pursued laid the groundwork for the next several decades of Crusader rule. His successor, Baldwin II, a cousin, inherited a kingdom far more stable and defined than the one Baldwin I had received. The coastal cities of Acre, Jaffa, Caesarea, and Beirut were firmly in Crusader hands, providing essential ports and revenue. The interior, though still dotted with Muslim enclaves, was largely controlled by the Franks. The military orders were growing in strength, and influence, providing a professional fighting force. Yet, the challenges remained immense. The kingdom was still a Latin island in a Muslim sea, dependent on continued immigration and support from Europe. The delicate balance of power, both within the Crusader states and with their Muslim neighbors, was constantly shifting. But thanks to Baldwin I's tireless efforts, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, once a fragile dream, had become a tangible, if still vulnerable, reality. Its future poised precariously between the echoes of past crusades and the gathering storms of future conflicts. The very air of the kingdom, it seemed, still hummed with the echoes of his relentless campaigns and the quiet determination that had shaped its early years. The morning sun, though it promised warmth, often brought with it the chill of political maneuvering within the Kingdom of Jerusalem. While the city itself, with its sacred sites, remained the glittering prize, the reality of governing this transplanted European society in the Levant was far more complex than the fervent cries of the First Crusade had ever suggested. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, though preeminent, was but one star in a constellation of Crusader states, each with its own ambitions, its own internal squabbles, and its own precarious relationship with its neighbors, both Christian and Muslim. North of Jerusalem lay the Principality of Antioch, a powerful entity forged by Bohemond of Taranto, a figure whose cunning often overshadowed his piety. Further east, beyond the Orontes River, sat the County of Edessa, the first Crusader state to be established, yet also the most vulnerable, a distant outpost against the Turkish lands. And to the south, along the coast, the County of Tripoli, a later creation, carved out after years of arduous siege. These were not harmonious siblings, but rather a collection of often competing entities, bound by a shared, yet frequently strained, Christian identity. Within Jerusalem itself, the early years were marked by a delicate balance of power, often teetering on the brink of internal strife. Godfrey of Bouillon, the first ruler, had famously refused the title of king, preferring that of advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, a humble gesture that perhaps masked the immense challenge of establishing a stable monarchy. His successor, Baldwin I, however, embraced the crown, understanding that the trappings of kingship were essential for asserting authority over the disparate feudal lords who had accompanied him. He was a pragmatic ruler, keenly aware that the survival of the kingdom depended not just on divine favor, but on solid alliances and a firm hand. The population of the kingdom was a tapestry woven from many threads. The Frankish conquerors, a minority ruling class, the indigenous Christian communities, Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Syrian Jacobite, who had lived under Muslim rule for centuries, and the Muslim majority, whose presence was a constant, undeniable reality. Governing such a diverse populace, with different languages, customs, and legal traditions, was an immense undertaking. The Franks, accustomed to the feudal systems of Europe, found themselves adapting, sometimes awkwardly, to the existing structures of the Levant. While they introduced European feudalism, they also retained aspects of the existing legal framework, particularly for the non-Frankish populations, creating a fascinating, if sometimes chaotic, blend of legal systems. Succession was a perennial problem, a whispered anxiety that often erupted into open conflict. Unlike the established dynasties of Europe, the Crusader states were new creations, their lines of succession often fragile, dependent on the longevity of a single strong ruler or the timely arrival of a suitable heir from overseas. When a king died without a direct male heir, or when a child ascended the throne, regencies became battlegrounds for ambitious nobles. Take, for instance, the turbulent period following the death of Baldwin I in 1118. His cousin, Baldwin of Leper, was chosen as his successor, but not without considerable debate and maneuvering among the powerful barons. Such moments of transition were always fraught with peril, for they invited not only internal challenges, but also the opportunistic advances of external enemies. The Crusader states, particularly Jerusalem, relied heavily on the military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, whose origins lay in the pious desire to protect pilgrims and care for the sick. These orders, however, grew into formidable military and economic powers, acquiring vast landholdings and fortresses. While indispensable for defense, their immense wealth and independent command structure had sometimes placed them at odds with the crown and the secular nobility. Historians still debate the true extent of their political influence and whether their independent power ultimately strengthened or weakened the kingdom. Did their unwavering devotion to their vows provide a steadfast bulwark, or did their occasional disregard for royal authority sow seeds of disunity? It is a question that lingers, like the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams of a forgotten hall. The internal struggles were not merely about power. They were also about land, about strategic fortresses, and about the control of trade routes. The prosperity of the kingdom, particularly Jerusalem, depended on its ports and its access to the lucrative trade flowing through the Levant. Cities like Acre, Tyre, and Sidon became vital economic hubs, drawing merchants from east and west. The control of these coastal cities, with their customs revenues and their bustling markets, was a constant source of contention among the various lords and even between the crown and the powerful Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, who had helped secure these ports and demanded significant privileges in return. These republics, with their powerful fleets and their vast commercial networks, were both indispensable allies and formidable rivals, their trading interests often taking precedence over the broader political needs of the kingdom. The challenges of governing a diverse population extended beyond legal systems. Cultural differences, religious sensitivities, and the sheer logistical demands of maintaining a Frankish society in a foreign land were immense. The Franks, while often rigid in their religious beliefs, were pragmatic enough to recognize the necessity of coexisting with the local populations. Arabic became a language of administration and commerce, and many Franks, particularly those born in the Levant, became fluent in it, adopting local customs and even intermarrying with indigenous Christians. This cultural assimilation, however, was not uniform and often led to tensions with newly arrived Crusaders from Europe, who viewed such adaptations with suspicion, seeing them as a dilution of their Christian identity. The constant need for defense also drained the kingdom's resources and manpower. The Crusader states were surrounded by powerful Muslim emirates and sultanates, and the truce agreements, when they existed, were often fragile and short-lived. The need to maintain a standing army, to garrison numerous castles, and to respond to raids and sieges was an unending burden. This military imperative often exacerbated internal divisions, as lords squabbled over their contributions to campaigns or their share of the spoils. The very nature of a frontier kingdom, constantly at war or preparing for it, meant that military prowess often trumped administrative skill in the eyes of many. One lesser-known detail of this period is the surprising resilience of the local Christian communities. Despite being caught between Frankish rulers and Muslim neighbors, many managed to maintain their distinct identities, their churches, and their communal structures. They often served as vital intermediaries, providing essential knowledge of the local landscape, languages, and customs. While sometimes viewed with suspicion by the Franks, their continued presence was a testament to their deep roots in the land and their ability to adapt to changing political tides. They paid taxes to the Franks, but often retained their own ecclesiastical hierarchies and legal autonomy in many aspects of daily life. The political landscape was further complicated by the arrival of new waves of Crusaders from Europe. While these fresh arrivals brought much-needed manpower and resources, they often arrived with their own agendas, their own rivalries, and a profound ignorance of the complex political realities of the Levant. They frequently clashed with the Poulans, the native-born Franks, who had a more nuanced understanding of the delicate balance of power and the necessity of pragmatic diplomacy with Muslim rulers. These tensions often led to disastrous military decisions, as newly arrived zealous knights disregarded the counsel of experienced local commanders, leading to costly defeats. The very concept of a Crusader state was a novel one, an experiment in transplanted European feudalism. It was an attempt to impose a familiar political structure onto a profoundly different social and geographical reality. The kings of Jerusalem, for all their power, were often caught between the demands of their powerful vassals, the influence of the military orders, the commercial interests of the Italian maritime republics, and the ever-present threat from their Muslim neighbors. The story of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, therefore, is not merely one of grand battles and religious fervor, but also one of persistent internal struggles, of the delicate art of governance, and of the constant negotiation of power in a land where every alliance was provisional and every peace a temporary reprieve. Perhaps these walls, built layer upon layer by different hands, whispered stories not just of faith and conquest, but of the endless, grinding work of maintaining a fragile kingdom against overwhelming odds. A testament to human ambition, resilience, and the enduring complexity of power. The air in the Levant, once thick with the dust of Crusader triumphs, began to shift, carrying with it the scent of change, a subtle yet persistent fragrance of burgeoning unity from the east. For decades, the Frankish kingdoms had thrived, not just on their martial prowess, but on the deep fissures that fractured the Islamic world around them. Local emirs and atabegs, often more concerned with their own petty rivalries and territorial squabbles, had presented a mosaic of disunity, an easy target for the disciplined, if often brutal, Frankish incursions. But the tide, like a slow-moving river, was beginning to turn, its currents gathering strength in the distant reaches of Mesopotamia and Syria. From this fertile crescent, a new power was rising, embodied in the figure of Imad ad-Din Zengi, a name that would soon echo with a mixture of dread and hope across the fractured lands. Zengi, born around 1085, was an atabeg, a military governor who inherited the city of Mosul in 1127. He was not a man of subtle diplomacy or grand pronouncements, but a pragmatist, a warrior forged in the crucible of constant conflict. His ambition was as vast as the desert sky, and his methods were direct, often ruthless. He understood that the key to pushing back the Franks lay not in individual skirmishes, but in the painstaking, often brutal process of unification. His gaze, keen and unblinking, fell first upon the fragmented Muslim territories. He saw the weakness in their divisions, the vulnerability in their squabbling. He began a methodical campaign, not against the Franks initially, but against his fellow Muslim rulers, coercing, conquering and consolidating power. Aleppo, a vital trading hub and a city of ancient lineage, fell to him in 1128, a significant step in establishing his dominion over northern Syria. This was not a swift, romantic conquest, but a grinding, strategic effort, city by city, fortress by fortress. He was building a new foundation, brick by painstaking brick, from the scattered remnants of a once great empire. The Franks, for their part, were slow to grasp the true nature of this emerging threat. They saw Zengi as just another ambitious emir, another local strongman to be dealt with through alliances, raids, or occasional battles. They continued their internal squabbles, their princely disputes over succession and territory, seemingly oblivious to the gathering storm. Perhaps the very success of their initial conquests had lulled them into a false sense of security, a belief in their own divine right to rule. The memory of the First Crusade, with its miraculous victories against overwhelming odds, still cast a long shadow, fostering the dangerous complacency. Zengi's true genius lay in his understanding of strategic geography and the psychology of power. He knew that to truly challenge the Franks, he needed a symbol, a victory so profound that it would ignite a fire of renewed purpose across the Muslim world. That symbol, that vital strategic point, was Edessa. The county of Edessa, established during the First Crusade, was the easternmost of the Crusader states, a vulnerable outpost surrounded by Muslim territories. Its very existence was a constant provocation, a thorn in the side of any aspiring Muslim unifier. In 1144, Zengi turned his full attention to Edessa. The city, though well fortified, was isolated, and its count, Jocelyn II, was absent, having ridden out with most of his army to aid a local ally. Zengi seized the opportunity. He laid siege to the city, employing sophisticated siege engines and sappers to undermine its walls. The siege was brutal, lasting for weeks. The defenders, a mix of Frankish knights and local Christians, fought valiantly, but without relief. Their fate was sealed. On December 24, 1144, the walls of Edessa were breached and Zengi's forces poured into the city. The fall of Edessa sent shockwaves through both the Christian and Muslim worlds. For the Franks, it was a devastating blow. The first major Crusader territory to be permanently lost. For the Muslims, it was a beacon of hope, a tangible sign that the tide could indeed be turned. The news of Edessa's fall reached Europe, sparking outrage and fear. It was the direct catalyst for the Second Crusade, a massive undertaking that saw kings and emperors like Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany take the cross. Yet even this grand response would ultimately falter, largely due to the continued disunity among the Franks themselves and the growing strength of their Muslim adversaries. Zengi, however, did not live to see the full impact of his victory. Less than 2 years after Edessa's fall, in 1146, he was assassinated by one of his own slaves, a curious and somewhat obscure detail that historians still debate. Was it a personal grievance? A political conspiracy? The exact motives remain shrouded in the mists of time, a minor mystery within the grand narrative. His death might have been expected to plunge his nascent empire back into chaos, but Zengi had perhaps unwittingly laid the groundwork for an even greater leader. His son, Nur al-Din Mahmud Zengi, inherited a complex legacy. Born in 1118, Nur al-Din was a different kind of leader than his father. While equally formidable in battle, he possessed a deeper sense of religious piety and a more strategic vision for unifying the Muslim world. He understood that military might alone was not enough. True unity required ideological cohesion. He cultivated a reputation for justice, piety, and scholarly patronage, presenting himself not just as a conqueror, but as a righteous defender of Islam. This shift in emphasis was crucial. While Zengi had been a pragmatic unifier, Nur al-Din sought to inspire, to rally the faithful under a common banner of jihad against the Frankish invaders. Nur al-Din's early reign was marked by consolidating his father's gains and expanding his influence. He faced immediate challenges, including attempts by Jocelyn II to retake Edessa, which Nur al-Din decisively crushed. He then turned his attention to Damascus, a vital, wealthy city that had long maintained a delicate, often uneasy, truce with the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The rulers of Damascus, the Burid dynasty, were often more concerned with preserving their independence from Aleppo and Mosul than with fighting the Franks. This pragmatic approach had allowed them to survive, but it also left them vulnerable. Nur al-Din understood the strategic importance of Damascus. Its capture would not only unify Syria under his rule, but would also create a formidable barrier between the Crusader states and the heartlands of the Muslim world. He launched several campaigns against Damascus, facing resistance not only from its rulers, but also from their occasional Frankish allies. The political landscape was incredibly complex, with alliances shifting like desert sands. Historians still debate the extent to which the Franks truly understood the long-term implications of their alliances with certain Muslim factions against others. Did they truly believe they could perpetually play one side against another? Or were they simply reacting to immediate threats and opportunities? Eventually, in 1154, after years of political maneuvering and military pressure, Nur al-Din entered Damascus. This was a pivotal moment. With Damascus under his control, Nur al-Din had effectively unified Muslim Syria, creating a powerful, contiguous state that encircled the Crusader territories from the north and east. The Franks were now truly hemmed in. Their easy access to allies and resources in the north severely curtailed. The political map of the Levant had been redrawn decisively. Nur al-Din's piety was not just for show. He established madrasas, religious schools, and hospitals, patronized scholars, and actively promoted Sunni Islam. He saw himself as a champion of orthodoxy, seeking to counter the perceived laxity and sectarian divisions that had weakened the Muslim world. He fostered a sense of collective purpose, reminding his people of the glory of their past and the imperative of reclaiming their lands from the invaders. This religious revival, coupled with his military prowess, made him a truly formidable adversary. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, under King Baldwin III and later Amalric I, found itself facing an increasingly unified and determined foe. The era of easy victories and fragmented opposition was over. Nur al-Din meticulously built up his military, focusing on disciplined cavalry and siege warfare. He was a master of strategy, often preferring to wear down his opponents through attrition and economic blockade rather than risking costly pitched battles. One of Nur al-Din's most significant strategic moves was his intervention in Egypt. Egypt, ruled by the Fatimid Caliphate, was a rich and fertile land, but its ruling dynasty was in decline, plagued by internal strife and succession disputes. Both Nur al-Din and the Franks saw Egypt as a vital prize. Its wealth and resources could tip the balance of power decisively. Beginning in the 1160s, a series of proxy wars erupted over control of Egypt, with Nur al-Din sending his brilliant Kurdish general Shirkuh and his nephew Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin, to intervene on behalf of one Fatimid faction or another. The Egyptian campaigns were complex, protracted affairs involving multiple invasions by both Nur al-Din's forces and the Franks. At one point, King Amalric I of Jerusalem launched several invasions of Egypt, even reaching the gates of Cairo. However, Nur al-Din's forces, led by Shirkuh and Saladin, proved more persistent and ultimately more successful. In 1169, Shirkuh became vizier of Egypt, and upon his death shortly after, Saladin inherited the position. This was a critical turning point. Saladin, though nominally Nur al-Din's subordinate, began to consolidate his own power in Egypt, eventually abolishing the weakened Fatimid Caliphate in 1171 and bringing Egypt back into the fold of Sunni Islam, albeit under his own burgeoning authority. The rise of Saladin in Egypt, while a triumph for Nur al-Din in one sense, also introduced a new dynamic. Nur al-Din was now faced with a powerful, ambitious subordinate who controlled the immense wealth of Egypt. While Saladin continued to acknowledge Nur al-Din's suzerainty, their relationship grew increasingly complex, marked by a delicate balance of power and ambition. Nur al-Din, ever the strategist, was reportedly planning to march on Egypt himself to assert his full authority over Saladin, but fate intervened. In 1174, Nur al-Din fell ill and died, perhaps from a sudden fever, in Damascus. He was only 56 years old. His death, like his father's, created a power vacuum. He had spent his life meticulously building a unified Muslim state, but his sudden demise left his young son, As-Salih Ismail al-Malik, as his heir, too young to hold together the vast territories his father had forged. The stage was now set for Saladin, the ambitious general from Egypt, to step out of Nur al-Din's shadow and claim the mantle of leadership. A story that would unfold with dramatic consequences for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The legacy of Zengi and Nur al-Din was profound. They had transformed the political landscape of the Levant, shifting the balance of power decisively away from the Franks. Zengi, with his raw ambition and military might, had initiated the process of unification and delivered the first major blow at Edessa. Nur al-Din, with his blend of military skill, religious piety, and strategic vision, had expanded upon his father's work, consolidating Syria and bringing Egypt into the orbit of unified Muslim power. They had not yet expelled the Franks from the Holy Land, but they had created the conditions under which such an expulsion became not just a distant dream, but a tangible possibility. The Crusader states, once seemingly impregnable, now faced a unit. Determined, an increasingly powerful adversary, ready to challenge their very existence. The air, once scented with Frankish confidence, now carried the heavy, undeniable fragrance of impending conflict, a scent of destiny unfolding. The news of Edessa's fall, carried by desperate messengers across the Mediterranean, struck Europe like a thunderclap. It was a stark, undeniable truth. The dream of the Latin East, once so vibrant and seemingly invincible, was now vulnerable, its foundations shaken. Pope Eugenius III, exiled from Rome and residing in Viterbo, was deeply moved by the pleas for aid. He understood the gravity of the situation, not just for the distant Crusader states, but for the very soul of Christendom. In December of 1145, he issued the papal bull Quantum Predecessors, a powerful call to arms, echoing the fervent appeals of Urban II. Yet the initial response was muted, perhaps a reflection of the lingering weariness from the First Crusade, or the internal political struggles that consumed European monarchs. It took the eloquent and fiery preaching of Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential figures of the 12th century, to truly ignite the crusading fervor. Bernard, a Cistercian abbot renowned for his piety and intellectual prowess, crisscrossed France and Germany, his words weaving a tapestry of spiritual urgency and divine promise. He spoke of Edessa not merely as a lost city, but as a wound in the side of Christ, a challenge to the faith of every true believer. He offered the same spiritual indulgences as Urban II, full remission of sins for those who took the cross, a direct path to salvation for those who died in the holy cause. His charisma was such that crowds, swept up by his impassioned sermons, would tear their garments to fashion crosses, eager to join the sacred enterprise. It was said that the supply of cloth ran out in some towns due to the sheer number of volunteers. Among those moved by Bernard's words were two of Europe's most powerful monarchs, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. This was a significant departure from the First Crusade, which had been led by a collection of powerful nobles. Here, for the first time, crowned kings would lead the armies of the cross. Louis, a young and devout king, had already been contemplating a pilgrimage to the Holy Land as penance for a brutal massacre in Vitry. Conrad, initially hesitant, was eventually persuaded by Bernard's compelling rhetoric, even falling to his knees in penitence during one of the abbot's sermons. The combined might of these two kingdoms, it was hoped, would be an irresistible force, capable of not only reclaiming Edessa, but securing the very future of the Latin East. The Second Crusade, however, was plagued by misfortune and miscalculation from its very inception. The German contingent, under Conrad III, set out first in the spring of 1147. Their march across the Byzantine Empire was fraught with tension and suspicion. Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, ever wary of large Western armies traversing his lands, was concerned about their intentions, remembering the depredations of the First Crusade. Skirmishes over supplies and accusations of treachery marred their passage. Once in Anatolia, the Germans chose a more direct, but ultimately perilous inland route. Their army, poorly supplied and ill-disciplined, was ambushed and decimated by the Seljuk Turks near Dorialayum, the same area where the First Crusade had fought a crucial battle. The vast majority of Conrad's forces were slaughtered, and he himself barely escaped with his life, forced to retreat with a shattered remnant. Louis VII's French army, following a similar path, fared little better. They too encountered hostility from the Byzantines and suffered from the same logistical challenges. In the rugged mountains of Anatolia, near the Cadmus Mountains, the French rearguard was ambushed by the Turks. The ensuing battle was a disaster, with heavy losses and the king himself narrowly avoiding capture. The remaining French forces, demoralized and exhausted, eventually reached the coastal city of Italia, from where Louis, fearing further losses, chose to abandon his infantry and sail directly to Antioch with his knights. This decision, though perhaps pragmatic, was seen by many as a betrayal of his vows and further eroded the morale of the Crusaders. Upon their arrival in the Holy Land, the remnants of the crusading armies faced a complex and often contradictory political landscape. Raymond of Poitiers, the Prince of Antioch, was eager for the Crusaders to help him reclaim lost territories and secure his northern borders against Nur ad-Din, Zengi's son and successor, who was consolidating his power in Aleppo. Raymond even offered his niece, Constance, in marriage to Louis, perhaps hoping to solidify an alliance. However, Louis, still recovering from his arduous journey and perhaps wary of Raymond's motives, refused. There were also whispers, never fully substantiated, that Eleanor of Aquitaine, Louis's queen, was growing too close to her uncle Raymond, adding another layer of personal intrigue to the political tensions. The High Court of Jerusalem, the ruling council of the kingdom, held a crucial assembly at Acre to determine the Crusades' objective. Despite the pleas from Antioch and the original impetus of Edessa's fall, the decision was made to attack Damascus. This choice has long been a subject of scholarly debate and historical mystery. Why Damascus? It was the last independent Muslim city in Syria, a wealthy and strategically vital center. Some historians argue that it was seen as a way to cripple Nur ad-Din's growing power by removing a potential ally and securing Jerusalem's eastern flank. Others suggest that the Franks of Jerusalem, having maintained a fragile alliance with Damascus against Nur ad-Din for some time, saw an opportunity to eliminate a potential future threat and expand their own territory. Perhaps it was a miscalculation, an overestimation of their own strength, or a profound misunderstanding of the delicate balance of power in the region. The decision certainly alienated the Damascenes, who had previously been open to alliances with the Franks against the more aggressive Zengi and now Nur ad-Din. The siege of Damascus began in July 1148. The combined armies of Louis, Conrad, and the Latin forces of Jerusalem laid siege to the ancient city. Initially, the Crusaders made good progress, pushing through the orchards and gardens surrounding the city walls. However, internal divisions and mistrust soon began to fester. There were disagreements over tactics, accusations of bribery, and a palpable lack of coordination between the various contingents. The local Frankish barons, who knew the terrain and the Damascene defenses intimately, found their advice often ignored by the European monarchs, who were unfamiliar with the intricacies of Levantine warfare. The Damascenes, under their ruler Mu'in ad-Din Unur, put up a fierce resistance, aided by the city's strong fortifications and the support of their populace. As the siege dragged on, Nur ad-Din, seeing an opportunity to expand his influence, began to move his forces towards Damascus, offering aid to the besieged city. The Damascenes, facing a dire situation, reluctantly accepted Nur ad-Din's offer, knowing that it might come at a cost to their independence. The prospect of Nur ad-Din's powerful army arriving to relieve the city, combined with dwindling supplies and growing internal dissent among the Crusaders, forced a painful decision. After just 4 days, the siege was abandoned. The Crusader armies retreated in disarray, their morale shattered, their grand objectives unfulfilled. The failure of the Second Crusade was a profound humiliation for Christendom and a catastrophic blow to the Crusader states. It exposed the deep fissures within the Latin East, the lack of strategic unity between the European monarchs and the local barons, and the devastating consequences of poor leadership and logistical planning. Conrad III returned to Germany soon after, his army largely destroyed, his reputation tarnished. Louis VII lingered in the Holy Land for another year, making a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but offering little practical assistance. He returned to France in 1149, leaving behind a kingdom that felt abandoned and vulnerable. The aftermath of the Second Crusade saw a significant shift in the balance of power in the Levant. Nur ad-Din, the shrewd and ambitious son of Zengi, emerged as the undisputed champion of the Muslim world. The Damascenes, having been abandoned by their former Frankish allies and pressured by Nur ad-Din's growing strength, eventually fell under his sway. In 1154, Nur ad-Din formally annexed Damascus, uniting Muslim Syria under his banner. This created a formidable, unified Muslim power bloc directly bordering the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a strategic nightmare for the Franks. The dream of a secure, expanded Latin East now seemed more distant than ever. The psychological impact of the Crusades' failure was equally profound. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Crusader states since the First Crusade was irrevocably shattered. Europeans began to question the efficacy of crusading, and the spiritual promises made by figures like Bernard of Clairvaux seemed to ring hollow in the face of such abject defeat. Bernard himself, who had promised divine favor, struggled to reconcile the disaster with his fervent beliefs, attributing the failure to the sins of the Crusaders rather than a flaw in the holy enterprise itself. For the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the consequences were immediate and severe. They were now surrounded by a powerful, unified Muslim enemy. The northern states, Antioch and Tripoli, were particularly exposed. The kingdom itself entered a period of internal instability as the ruling elite grappled with the new geopolitical reality. The need for strong, decisive leadership became paramount, and the internal politics of the court grew increasingly complex. The failure of the Second Crusade also highlighted a growing chasm between the ideals of crusading and the realities on the ground. The European monarchs, accustomed to the feudal structures and political maneuvering of their homelands, often struggled to adapt to the unique challenges of warfare and diplomacy in the Levant. Their grand, sweeping strategies often clashed with the more nuanced, localized concerns of the resident Franks, who understood the delicate web of alliances and rivalries that characterized the region. This disunity, a recurring theme, would continue to plague the Crusader states. Yet even in the shadow of this defeat, life in the Latin East continued. The Franks of Jerusalem, though diminished, were not broken. They adapted, forming new alliances, strengthening fortifications, and refining their military tactics. They understood that their survival depended on their own resilience and ingenuity, rather than relying solely on intermittent and often disastrous aid from Europe. The Templars and Hospitallers, the military orders born out of the First Crusade, grew in power and influence, becoming crucial defenders of the Latin East. Their fortresses, like Crac de Chevaliers, stood as formidable symbols of Frankish presence, their disciplined knights the vanguard of the kingdom's defense. These orders, initially formed to protect pilgrims, had evolved into powerful, independent military forces, often acting with a degree of autonomy that sometimes put them at odds with the secular rulers of the kingdom. The kingdom, despite its vulnerabilities, also saw moments of internal strength. Baldwin III, who had been a co-ruler with his mother Melisende, asserted his authority, becoming sole king in 1153. He was a capable and intelligent ruler, understanding the need for strategic alliances and a stronger military. He recognized the growing threat of Nur ad-Din and sought to counter it through both diplomacy and military action. His reign would be marked by a series of defensive wars and a continuous struggle to maintain the fragile existence of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in a hostile environment. The Second Crusade, therefore, serves as a pivotal moment, not just a military failure, but a profound turning point. It marked the end of an era of perceived Frankish dominance and ushered in a period of intense pressure, an existential threat for the Crusader states. The dream of a vast, expanding Latin empire in the East faded, replaced by the grim reality of a struggle for survival against a unified and increasingly powerful Muslim world. The bells of Jerusalem, though still ringing, now carried a more somber, urgent tone, a constant reminder of the ever-present danger that lurked beyond their walls. The vibrant tapestry of the Latin East, once so brightly colored, now had threads of anxiety and uncertainty woven deeply into its very fabric. The year 1174 dawned upon Jerusalem with a fragile hope, yet beneath its shimmering light, the seeds of profound change were already stirring. Amalric, the king who had sought to balance diplomacy with military might, passed away, leaving a void that felt almost too vast to fill. His successor, a boy of just 13 years, ascended the throne as Baldwin IV. But even as the crown was placed upon his young head, a shadow lingered, not of doubt in his lineage, but of a cruel affliction that would define his reign: leprosy. This was no ordinary challenge. Leprosy in the 12th century was a sentence of isolation, fear, and slow decay. Yet from this boy king, an unexpected strength would emerge. Baldwin IV, despite the escalating physical toll of his disease, displayed a remarkable courage and a strategic acumen that belied his youth and his suffering. He would become known to history as the Leper King, a figure both tragic and inspiring, who against all odds held the Kingdom of Jerusalem together in its most perilous hour. His early years on the throne were guided by regents, first Miles of Plancy, then Raymond III of Tripoli, a cousin whose political ambitions were as keen as his military skills. These were years of delicate balance, as the Frankish lords, ever watchful of their own interests, navigated the ascension of a king whose future was uncertain. The kingdom, though still vibrant, found itself increasingly encircled. To the south and east, the formidable figure of Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, was consolidating his power, dreaming of a unified Islamic empire that would sweep the Franks from the Holy Land. Saladin, a man of immense charisma and military genius, had already begun to test the Frankish defenses. His raids were probing, designed to assess weaknesses, to sow discord, and to gradually tighten the noose around the Crusader states. The Franks, for their part, responded with a mix of defensive maneuvers and occasional, daring counter-raids, often led by figures like Reynald of Chatillon, a lord whose audacious, often reckless, actions would prove both a boon and a bane to the kingdom. One of the most significant early tests of Baldwin IV's reign came in 1177 at the Battle of Montazard. Saladin, believing the young king to be incapacitated or simply inexperienced, launched a massive invasion force into the Kingdom of Jerusalem. His army, estimated to be around 26,000 strong, vastly outnumbered the Frankish forces, which perhaps numbered no more than 375 knights and a few thousand infantry. Baldwin, then only 16, despite the early signs of his disease beginning to manifest more acutely, chose to meet Saladin in open battle. The circumstances leading to Montazard were fraught with tension. Saladin had marched swiftly, bypassing Gaza and Ascalon, aiming directly for Jerusalem. The Frankish army, led by Baldwin himself, along with Reynald of Chatillon and the Knights Templar, was forced to march at speed to intercept him. Historians still debate the precise location of the battle, though it is generally placed near Ramla, close to the ancient site of Gezer. What is certain is the sheer audacity of the Frankish decision to engage such a superior force. As Saladin's forces pillaged the countryside, spreading out, perhaps growing overconfident, Baldwin seized his moment. He attacked with a ferocity that stunned the Ayyubid army. The Frankish heavy cavalry, a force known for its devastating charge, broke through the enemy lines with an almost legendary impact. Saladin's personal guard was scattered, and the Sultan himself narrowly escaped capture, fleeing on a swift dromedary. The victory at Montazard was a stunning triumph, a testament to Baldwin's leadership and the unwavering courage of his knights. It bought the kingdom precious time, shattering Saladin's aura of invincibility and forcing him to reconsider his strategy. For the young Leper King, it cemented his authority and earned him the respect, even awe, of his own lords and his enemies alike. Yet, Montgizard was but a temporary reprieve. Saladin, though defeated, was not broken. He learned from his mistakes, becoming more cautious, more strategic. The years that followed were marked by a relentless series of skirmishes, sieges, and diplomatic maneuvers. Baldwin, increasingly debilitated by his illness, found himself relying more and more on his inner circle, particularly his sister Sibylla and her husband, Guy of Lusignan, a man whose ambition often outstripped his judgment. The political landscape within the kingdom was as treacherous as the external threats. The Frankish lords, ever prone to internal squabbles, found themselves divided into factions. There was the court party, often associated with the royal family and those who favored a more aggressive stance against Saladin, and the barons' party, often led by Raymond III of Tripoli, who advocated for a more cautious approach, even seeking truces with the Sultan. This internal division, perhaps more than any external threat, began to gnaw at the foundations of the kingdom. One of the lesser-known but significant episodes of this period involves the construction of Le Chastelet, or Jacob's Ford Castle, in 1779. Baldwin, ever keen to exploit any strategic advantage, decided to build a formidable fortress at a crucial crossing point on the Jordan River, just north of the Sea of Galilee. This location, known as Jacob's Ford, was a vital artery for Saladin's communications and troop movements between his Syrian and Egyptian territories. The castle, intended to be a permanent thorn in Saladin's side, was built with astonishing speed, a testament to Frankish engineering and determination. However, Saladin, recognizing the existential threat this castle posed, acted decisively. He offered Baldwin a substantial sum of money to halt its construction, recognizing that a direct assault would be costly. When Baldwin refused, Saladin launched a massive siege. The castle, still under construction, fell after a mere 6 days of intense fighting. Saladin ordered its immediate demolition, ensuring it would never again threaten his supply lines. The Battle of Jacob's Ford, though a defeat for the Franks, highlights Baldwin's strategic foresight and Saladin's ruthless efficiency. It also reveals the immense resources Saladin was willing to expend to secure his strategic objectives. As the years passed, Baldwin's physical condition deteriorated visibly. His face became disfigured, his hands and feet slowly lost sensation, and his vision began to fail. Yet, his mind remained sharp, his will indomitable. He continued to ride into battle, often carried on a litter, his presence alone inspiring his troops. There are accounts of him, even in his advanced state, leading charges, his voice, though perhaps weakened, still ringing with command. This unwavering commitment, despite unimaginable pain, is perhaps the most enduring image of the Leper King. The question of succession loomed large over the kingdom. Baldwin, knowing his own life was fleeting, sought to secure the future. His sister Sibylla was the rightful heir. But her choice of husband, Guy of Lusignan, proved deeply unpopular with many of the Frankish lords, particularly Raymond III of Tripoli. Guy was seen as arrogant, indecisive, and lacking the necessary military prowess to lead the kingdom against Saladin. This deep-seated animosity between Guy and the powerful barons would have catastrophic consequences. In 1183, Baldwin, now gravely ill, took the extraordinary step of having his 5-year-old nephew, Baldwin V, crowned as co-king, hoping to ensure a smooth transition and bypass Guy. He even appointed Raymond III of Tripoli as regent for the young Baldwin V, a move designed to appease the powerful baron and secure the kingdom's stability. This decision, born of desperation and foresight, was a testament to Baldwin IV's profound concern for the future of Jerusalem. He understood that the kingdom needed strong, unified leadership, and he was willing to make difficult choices to achieve it. Yet even this carefully planned succession was fraught with peril. The seeds of discord had been sown too deeply. Raynald of Châtillon, ever the provocateur, continued his audacious raids on Muslim caravans, violating truces and providing Saladin with ample pretext for renewed hostilities. These raids, while enriching Raynald, undermined Baldwin's diplomatic efforts and further inflamed Saladin's determination to destroy the Crusader states. The end for Baldwin IV came in 1185. He was only 24 years old. His reign, though tragically short, had been one of relentless struggle and remarkable resilience. He had, against all medical and military odds, held the Kingdom of Jerusalem together, preventing Saladin from achieving his ultimate goal. His death plunged the kingdom into a period of acute instability. The young Baldwin V, his chosen successor, was frail and died less than a year later, in 1186, at the tender age of 8. With the death of Baldwin V, the carefully constructed succession plan unraveled. Sibylla, his mother, asserted her claim to the throne. In a controversial move, she was crowned queen, and then, against the wishes of many of the powerful barons, she crowned her husband, Guy of Lusignan, as king. This act effectively sidelined Raymond III of Tripoli and solidified the power of the court party, but it alienated a significant portion of the Frankish nobility. The ascension of Guy of Lusignan marked a critical turning point. He lacked the strategic brilliance of Baldwin IV, the diplomatic finesse of Amalric, or the sheer, brutal determination of figures like Raynald of Châtillon. He was, in essence, a king ill-suited for the immense challenges that lay ahead. The unity that Baldwin IV had so desperately fought to maintain fractured under Guy's reign. Historians still disagree on the precise extent to which Baldwin IV's illness contributed to the eventual fall of Jerusalem. Some argue that his prolonged suffering and the uncertainty of his succession created an environment of instability that Saladin expertly exploited. Others contend that even a healthy king would have faced an insurmountable challenge against Saladin's unified empire, and that Baldwin IV's reign was, in fact, a miraculous holding action. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, a poignant blend of human frailty and the relentless march of historical forces. The legacy of Baldwin IV is complex. He was a king who defied expectations, who found strength in the face of unimaginable adversity. He was a leader whose presence, even in his final, agonizing years, inspired loyalty and courage. He bought the Kingdom of Jerusalem precious time, perhaps delaying its inevitable fate. But his death, and the subsequent turbulent succession, left the kingdom vulnerable, divided, and ultimately ripe for the taking. The stage was now set for the final, devastating confrontation between the unified forces of Saladin and a fractured, ill-led Crusader kingdom. A confrontation that would culminate in the catastrophic Battle of Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem itself. The whispers of the wind across the Judean hills seemed to carry a mournful premonition of the end of an era that had, against all odds, been prolonged by the courage of a young king marked by suffering. The dry wind, carrying the scent of parched earth and distant dust, whispered across the parched plains of Galilee. It was the summer of 1187, a season that would forever etch itself into the memory of the Holy Land. The truce, a fragile thread woven by the pragmatic hand of Saladin and the ailing King Baldwin IV, had finally unraveled. With Baldwin's passing, and the brief, tragic reign of his young successor, Baldwin V, the crown had fallen to Guy of Lusignan, a man whose ambition often outstripped his judgment, and his wife, Sibylla, Baldwin IV's sister. The kingdom, already weakened by internal strife and the constant drain of resources, now faced a united and formidable foe in Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. Saladin, a figure of immense strategic brilliance and unwavering determination, had spent years consolidating his power, dreaming of the day he could reclaim Jerusalem for Islam. His patience was legendary. His preparations meticulous. He understood the Crusader kingdom's vulnerabilities, its reliance on European aid, its internal squabbles between powerful barons, and its limited manpower. He had observed, he had planned, and now the time was ripe. The provocation came swiftly. Reynald of Chatillon, a notoriously aggressive and unprincipled Crusader lord, broke the peace by attacking a Muslim caravan, seizing its goods and imprisoning its travelers. This act, a direct defiance of the truce, provided Saladin with the casus belli he needed. He demanded the release of the prisoners and their goods. Guy of Lusignan, swayed by Reynald's defiant stance, refused. The die was cast. Saladin began his campaign in earnest, besieging the strategically vital Crusader stronghold of Tiberias, on the Sea of Galilee. The city itself was not the primary objective. Rather, it was a lure, a bait to draw the Crusader army out into the open. Away from their fortified castles and reliable water sources, the Countess of Tripoli, Eshiva, Raymond III's wife, was trapped within Tiberias, a hostage in all but name. The Crusader leadership, gathered at Acre, faced a terrible dilemma. Raymond III of Tripoli, a seasoned and pragmatic warrior, argued vehemently against marching to relieve Tiberias. He understood the terrain, the scorching summer heat, and the scarcity of water. He advocated for a defensive strategy, keeping the army within their strongholds, forcing Saladin to besiege them, thereby exhausting his forces and exposing his supply lines. Raymond's logic was sound. A fortified army was a difficult target. An army marching across a desert plain in July was a death trap. He even suggested that Tiberias, though important, was a lesser loss compared to the entire Crusader army. However, Raymond's counsel was viewed with suspicion by many, particularly by Guy and his allies. Jaward de Riedefort, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, and Reynald of Chatillon. Raymond had a complex history with Guy, having initially opposed his claim to the throne. His pragmatic advice was seen by some as cowardice, or worse, as a betrayal, given that his wife was in Tiberias. The fervent, almost fanatical desire to relieve the Countess, coupled with the religious zeal that demanded immediate action against the infidel, overruled strategic common sense. Gerard de Riedefort, in particular, was a vocal proponent of marching, perhaps influenced by a previous defeat he had suffered against Saladin, seeking to redeem his honor through a direct confrontation. Ultimately, Guy of Lusignan made the fateful decision to march. On July 3, 1187, the vast Crusader army, numbering perhaps 20,000 men, including a significant contingent of heavily armored knights, began its grueling march from Sepphoris towards Tiberias. They carried with them the relic of the true cross, believing it would guarantee divine protection. The sun beat down mercilessly, transforming the dusty plain into an oven. The air shimmered with heat, and the knights, encased in their armor, began to suffer almost immediately. Saladin's scouts, ever vigilant, reported the Crusader movement. The Sultan, a master of psychological warfare and battlefield tactics, had anticipated this. He had ensured that every well and water source along the Crusaders' likely route was either poisoned or filled in. The Crusader army, already parched, found no relief. As the day wore on, the thirst became unbearable. Men and horses alike began to collapse. Heavy armor, designed for protection in battle, became a torturous burden under the scorching sun. The Crusader column, strung out and vulnerable, was constantly harassed by Saladin's light cavalry, who launched swift, stinging attacks, then retreated, further exhausting the Franks. By nightfall, the Crusader army, utterly spent, reached a small, dry valley near a twin-peaked hill known as the Horns of Hattin. They were still miles from Tiberias, and crucially, miles from the Sea of Galilee, their intended water source. Saladin's army, meanwhile, had encircled them, blocking their path to water. The Crusaders, desperate, attempted to set up camp, but even this was an ordeal. Saladin's archers rained arrows down on them throughout the night, denying them rest. The Muslims also lit brush fires downwind, choking the Crusaders with smoke, adding to their misery. The morning of July 4th dawned, revealing a scene of utter despair. The Crusader army was dehydrated, exhausted, and demoralized. Their discipline began to fray. The knights, once the invincible core of the army, were now struggling to even stand. The infantry, desperate for water, began to break ranks, attempting to fight their way towards the distant Sea of Galilee. The battle itself was a brutal, one-sided affair. Saladin's forces, fresh and well supplied with water, pressed their advantage. The Mamluk cavalry, renowned for their skill, launched relentless charges, while archers poured volleys of arrows into the dense Crusader ranks. The Crusader cavalry, weakened by thirst and fatigue, found it impossible to mount effective charges. Their horses were dying beneath them. A particularly poignant moment came when the infantry, driven by an overwhelming thirst, tried to break through the Muslim lines to reach the water. They were cut down in droves. The true cross, carried into battle as a symbol of hope and divine favor, was captured by Saladin's forces, a devastating blow to Crusader morale. Raymond III of Tripoli, seeing the battle was lost and fearing the complete annihilation of the army, led a desperate charge through a gap in the Muslim lines, managing to escape with a small contingent of his knights. This act, while saving some lives, further fueled the accusations of treachery against him, though historians still debate whether it was a pre-planned escape or a desperate, spontaneous breakout. Some accounts suggest Saladin's forces deliberately opened a path for Raymond, perhaps to sow further discord among the Crusaders or to allow a respected foe to escape. The remaining Crusader army, trapped and encircled, made a last stand on the Horns of Hattin. King Guy, Gerard de Ridfort, Raynald of Chatillon, and many other prominent lords fought valiantly, but it was a futile gesture. By the end of the day, the Crusader army was utterly destroyed. Thousands lay dead on the battlefield, their bodies baking in the sun. Thousands more were captured. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Saladin, a man of profound religious conviction, had vowed to execute Raynald of Chatillon for his repeated transgressions and his attack on the Muslim caravan. He personally struck Raynald down, fulfilling his oath. The Knights Templar and Hospitaller, viewed as the most fanatical and dangerous of the Crusader orders, were largely executed on Saladin's orders, a chilling display of his resolve. The other captured knights and soldiers were either enslaved or held for ransom. King Guy of Lusignan was spared, a pragmatic decision in by Saladin, who likely saw more value in a living defeated king than a martyred one. The Battle of Hattin was an unmitigated catastrophe for the Crusader kingdom. It effectively annihilated its standing army, leaving the remaining cities and castles virtually undefended. The loss of manpower, particularly the experienced knights, was irreparable. The psychological blow was equally devastating. The capture of the true cross, and the utter defeat of the combined Crusader forces shattered the aura of invincibility that had once surrounded the Franks. News of the defeat spread like wildfire across the Holy Land, sowing panic and despair. Saladin, seizing the moment, wasted no time. With the Crusader army gone, he began a systematic campaign of conquest, sweeping through the undefended cities and castles. Acre, Sidon, Beirut, Jaffa, and Ascalon fell one after another, often with little resistance. The garrisons were too small, the walls too poorly manned. The local populations, many of whom were Eastern Christians or native Muslims, offered little resistance to Saladin's well-organized and victorious forces. The ultimate prize, of course, was Jerusalem. The holy city, the very heart of the Crusader kingdom, was now vulnerable. Its defenses were manned by a mere handful of knights and a hastily assembled militia, largely composed of pilgrims and citizens. Baldwin of Ibelin, one of the few prominent nobles to have escaped Hattin, rushed to Jerusalem to organize its defense. He was granted permission by Saladin to pass through his lines to retrieve his family from the city, a testament to Saladin's chivalry. But Baldwin then vowed to stay and defend Jerusalem, a promise Saladin reluctantly accepted. The siege of Jerusalem began on September 20th, 1187. Saladin's army, flushed with victory, surrounded the city. The defenders, though outnumbered and outmatched, put up a courageous fight. Baldwin of Ibelin, demonstrating remarkable leadership, organized the defense, even knighting 50 burghers to bolster the ranks of the knights. For 12 days, they held out against Saladin's relentless assaults. The Muslim engineers worked tirelessly, undermining the walls, while siege engines battered the fortifications. Despite their bravery, the situation was hopeless. The walls were breached, and the defenders were exhausted. Baldwin, recognizing the inevitable, rode out to negotiate with Saladin. He threatened to destroy the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the most sacred Muslim sites in Jerusalem, and to kill all the Muslim prisoners if Saladin did not offer terms for surrender. This was a desperate gamble, a threat to commit an act that would have been anathema to Saladin's religious sensibilities. Saladin, a man of deep faith and a desire to avoid unnecessary bloodshed, was swayed by Baldwin's grim resolve. He agreed to allow the Christian inhabitants to leave the city in exchange for a ransom. Men were to pay 10 dinars, women 5, and children 1. Those who could not pay would be enslaved. This was a far more lenient term than the Crusaders had offered when they conquered Jerusalem in 1099, when they had massacred virtually the entire Muslim and Jewish population. Saladin's magnanimity, though still harsh by modern standards, stood in stark contrast to the brutality of the First Crusade. On October 2nd, 1187, Jerusalem surrendered. Saladin entered the city, marking a momentous turning point in the history of the Crusades. The Muslim flag was raised over the Dome of the Rock, and the golden cross that had adorned its summit since the First Crusade was pulled down. The Christian inhabitants, those who could pay the ransom, began their exodus, a long and sorrowful procession out of the city they had called home for nearly a century. Many, unable to pay, were indeed enslaved, though Saladin's brother, Al-Adil, and Saladin himself, in acts of charity, paid the ransoms for thousands of the poor, allowing them to depart freely. Churches, with the exception of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, were converted into mosques or put to other uses. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves across Europe. The news ignited a fervent desire for a new crusade, leading directly to the Third Crusade, which would see the likes of Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus attempt to reclaim the Holy City. But for the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the events of 1187 were a near-fatal blow. It had lost its capital, its holiest sites, and the vast majority of its territory. The kingdom was reduced to a few coastal cities, clinging precariously to the Levant. Its power was broken, its future uncertain. The dream of a lasting Latin presence in the Holy Land, once so vibrant, now seemed to flicker on the brink of extinction. The wind, which had carried the dust of Hattin, now carried the lament of a kingdom in ruins, a testament to strategic blunders, internal divisions, and the relentless ambition of a formidable foe. The sun, once a symbol of divine favor illuminating the Kingdom of Jerusalem, now beat down on a landscape irrevocably altered. The grand vision of a united Latin East, stretching from the Mediterranean to the Jordan, had dissolved into a bitter reality. Following the catastrophic defeat at Hattin and the subsequent fall of Jerusalem in 1187, the remnants of the Crusader states clung precariously to a few coastal strongholds. Tyre, Tripoli, and Antioch, battered but unbowed, became the last bastions of Frankish power, their walls a testament to a desperate, unyielding defiance. The dream of a vast kingdom was replaced by the grim necessity of survival. The very air, thick with the dust of shattered hopes and the distant echoes of Saladin's triumphant calls to prayer from the Holy City. News of Jerusalem's fall reverberated across Europe like a thunderclap, shattering the complacency that had settled over the Western world. Popes, kings, and commoners alike were struck by a profound sense of shock and shame. Pope Urban III reportedly died of grief upon hearing the news, and his successor, Gregory VIII, immediately issued the papal bull Audita Tremendi, heard of the tremendous calamity, in October 1187. This powerful decree called for a new crusade, urging the faithful to take up the cross once more and reclaim the lost patrimony of Christ. The response was immediate and widespread, though perhaps not entirely unified in its purpose. For some, it was a genuine spiritual calling, a penance for past sins, and a fervent desire to liberate the Holy Sepulchre. For others, it was an opportunity for glory, for land, or for the absolution of debts. Regardless of individual motivations, the collective will of Christendom began to stir, gathering its immense, if often unwieldy strength for a monumental undertaking. 3 of Europe's most powerful monarchs answered the call, their names destined to be etched into the annals of history. Frederick I Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, Philip II Augustus, King of France, and Richard I, King of England, soon to be known as the Lionheart. Each brought with them vast armies, immense resources, and distinct personalities that would shape the course of the Third Crusade. Frederick Barbarossa, a seasoned and respected leader in his late 60s, chose the traditional overland route through Anatolia, a path fraught with peril and the ghosts of earlier, less fortunate crusades. His army, a formidable force of German knights and foot soldiers, was the first to depart. Their journey was arduous, marked by skirmishes with local populations and the harsh realities of campaigning in a distant land. Tragically, Frederick's campaign was cut short in June 1190, when he drowned while crossing the Salef River in Cilicia. His death was a devastating blow, not only to his army, which largely disbanded or returned home, but to the morale of the entire crusading effort. A significant portion of his remaining forces, however, continued under the command of his son, Frederick VI, Duke of Swabia, eventually reaching Acre. Meanwhile, Philip Augustus and Richard the Lionheart, long-standing rivals whose personal animosity often overshadowed their shared religious goals, opted for the sea route. Their departure was delayed by internal conflicts and logistical challenges, but by the summer of 1190, their fleets were finally ready. Philip, a shrewd and calculating monarch, was driven by a desire to assert French dominance and perhaps to weaken his English rival. Richard, on the other hand, was a warrior king of legendary prowess, charismatic and impulsive, with a genuine zeal for the Crusade and a thirst for military glory. His journey to the Holy Land was not without its own dramatic detours. In May 1191, he conquered Cyprus from its self-proclaimed ruler, Isaac Komnenos, a strategic move that provided a vital supply base for the Crusaders and prevented the island from falling into Saladin's hands. This acquisition, though seemingly a side quest, proved invaluable, offering a secure staging ground and a source of provisions for the long siege ahead. The primary objective for the arriving Crusader forces was the city of Acre, a vital port on the Palestinian coast that had fallen to Saladin in 1187. The siege of Acre had already begun in August 1189, initiated by Guy of Lusignan, the deposed king of Jerusalem, who had been released from captivity by Saladin. Guy, desperate to reclaim his lost kingdom and his honor, had gathered a small force and laid siege to the city, a bold but perhaps foolhardy move. Saladin, ever the master strategist, quickly responded, encircling the besieging Crusaders, effectively turning the siege into a double siege. The situation for the Crusaders outside Acre's walls was dire. They were trapped between the city and Saladin's larger field army, suffering from disease, starvation, and constant skirmishes. The arrival of the French and English fleets, laden with fresh troops, supplies, and siege engines, transformed the stalemate. The combined forces of the Third Crusade, now numbering in the tens of thousands, launched a relentless assault on Acre. The siege was a brutal, protracted affair, lasting over 2 years and marked by fierce fighting, innovative siege warfare, and immense casualties on both sides. Contemporary accounts describe the ground outside Acre as a charnel house, littered with the dead and dying. The Crusaders employed massive siege towers and trebuchets, while Saladin's forces within the city and his relieving army outside responded with their own formidable defenses and counterattacks. The arrival of Richard the Lionheart, a formidable military engineer and tactician, energized the Crusader effort. He personally directed the construction of siege engines and led charges, his presence inspiring his troops. Finally, after months of relentless bombardment and fierce assaults, the garrison of Acre, exhausted and starving, surrendered on July 12, 1191. The fall of Acre was a monumental victory for the Crusaders, a crucial psychological and strategic triumph after years of setbacks. However, the victory was immediately marred by a dark episode that stained Richard's reputation. Following the surrender, disputes arose over the terms of the agreement, particularly regarding the payment of a ransom and the return of Christian captives, including the True Cross. Impatient and perhaps angered by Saladin's perceived delays, Richard ordered the execution of some 2,700 Muslim prisoners of war outside Acre on August 20th, 1191. This act, while perhaps not entirely unprecedented in the brutal warfare of the era, was a shocking display of ruthlessness that deeply offended Saladin and solidified his resolve to resist the Crusaders at all costs. Historians still debate the precise motivations behind Richard's decision. Was it a calculated act of terror to demoralize Saladin's forces? Was it a pragmatic decision to eliminate a logistical burden and prevent potential recapture? Or was it simply a fit of rage and impatience? The truth remains elusive, shrouded in the mists of time and conflicting accounts. With Acre secured, the Crusaders faced a critical decision. What next? Philip Augustus, having achieved his objective and perhaps wary of Richard's growing prestige, announced his intention to return to France. His departure, ostensibly due to illness, was likely motivated by political considerations, leaving Richard in sole command of the Crusader army. This left Richard with the daunting task of leading the crusade to its ultimate goal, Jerusalem. The most direct route lay along the coast, a path that would allow the Crusader fleet to provide vital support and supplies. Saladin, anticipating this move, had ordered the destruction of coastal towns and fortifications, creating a scorched earth policy to deny the Crusaders provisions and shelter. The march south from Acre to Jaffa in September 1191 was one of the most celebrated and arduous campaigns of the Third Crusade. Richard meticulously organized his army, marching them in a tight, disciplined formation, with the infantry protecting the baggage train and the knights positioned to repel attacks. Saladin's forces, though avoiding a direct pitched battle, constantly harassed the Crusaders, launching swift, harassing attacks from the surrounding hills and forests. The most significant engagement of this march occurred on September 7, 1191, at the Battle of Arsuf. Saladin, determined to break the Crusader advance, launched a full-scale attack on Richard's army. The battle was a brutal, close-quarters affair, with both sides fighting with desperate ferocity. Richard, leading from the front, displayed his legendary courage and tactical brilliance. At a critical moment, he unleashed his heavy cavalry, shattering Saladin's lines and inflicting a decisive defeat on the Ayyubid army. The victory at Arsuf, though not a complete rout, was a significant psychological blow to Saladin and secured the Crusaders' control of the coastal plain. Following Arsuf, Richard's army advanced to Jaffa, which they quickly fortified and established as their new base of operations. From Jaffa, the path to Jerusalem lay open, a mere 40 miles inland. The Crusaders made 2 attempts to march on Jerusalem in January and June of 1192. Both attempts, however, were ultimately abandoned. The reasons for Richard's reluctance to press on to Jerusalem are complex and have been a subject of much historical debate. The first march, in the winter of 1192, was hampered by severe weather conditions. Heavy rains turned the roads into quagmires, making the movement of supplies and siege engines almost impossible. The Crusader army, already weakened by disease and attrition, was ill-equipped for a winter campaign in the Judean hills. The second attempt, in the summer of 1192, brought Richard's army within sight of the Holy City. From a vantage point, perhaps the hill of Beit Nuba, the Crusaders could see the walls of Jerusalem shimmering in the distance. It was a moment of profound emotion, the culmination of years of struggle and sacrifice. Yet, Richard again hesitated. His decision, though deeply unpopular with many of his devout Crusaders, was based on pragmatic considerations. He understood that even if they managed to capture Jerusalem, holding it would be an immense challenge. The city's fortifications had been strengthened by Saladin, and its supply lines would be vulnerable to constant harassment from the surrounding Muslim territories. Furthermore, Richard knew that many of his Crusaders, having fulfilled their vows, would likely return home after the city's capture, leaving a depleted garrison to defend it against Saladin's inevitable counterattack. A lesser-known detail of this period is that Richard's military council advised against the march, citing the logistical nightmare of supplying an army deep inland and the difficulty of holding a city that would be surrounded by hostile territory. They believed that a secure coastal strip was a more realistic and sustainable objective. Instead of assaulting Jerusalem, Richard focused on consolidating Crusader control over the coastal plain, rebuilding fortifications, and engaging in a war of attrition with Saladin. This strategy led to further skirmishes and negotiations. The most famous of these engagements was the Battle of Jaffa in August 1192. Saladin, having regrouped his forces, launched a surprise attack on Jaffa, hoping to recapture the vital port. Richard, who had been preparing to depart for England, famously rode to the city's relief with a small contingent of knights, leaping ashore from his ship and leading a desperate defense. The battle was a testament to Richard's personal bravery and military genius. Though vastly outnumbered, he fought with legendary ferocity, inspiring his men to repel Saladin's forces and secure Jaffa once more. It was a remarkable victory, further cementing Richard's reputation as an unparalleled warrior. Despite the military successes, the political realities of the situation weighed heavily on Richard. His own kingdom faced internal threats, and his resources were dwindling. Saladin, though militarily defeated at Arsuf and Jaffa, remained a formidable opponent, his vast empire still largely intact. Both leaders, weary of the protracted conflict and facing their own internal pressures, recognized the need for a resolution. In September 1192, after months of intense negotiations, Richard and Saladin finally concluded the Treaty of Jaffa. This treaty, a pragmatic compromise, brought an end to the Third Crusade. The terms of the Treaty of Jaffa were significant. It established a 3-year truce between the Crusaders and Saladin's Ayyubid Empire. Crucially, Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, a bitter pill for many Crusaders to swallow. However, the treaty guaranteed Christian pilgrims free and safe access to the Holy City and other holy sites. This was a major concession from Saladin and a vital achievement for the Crusaders, ensuring that the spiritual purpose of the pilgrimage could still be fulfilled. The Crusaders retained control of a narrow strip of coastal territory, stretching from Tyre in the north to Jaffa in the south, including the important cities of Acre, Haifa, and Arsuf. This effectively reduced the Kingdom of Jerusalem to a coastal remnant, a shadow of its former glory. The capital was eventually moved to Acre, which became the new administrative and commercial hub of the Latin East. Richard the Lionheart departed the Holy Land in October 1192, leaving behind a kingdom drastically reduced in size, but strategically viable. His crusade, though failing to achieve its ultimate goal of retaking Jerusalem, had been a military triumph. He had reclaimed vital coastal territories, secured Christian access to the holy sites, and demonstrated the formidable power of Western arms. His personal charisma and military prowess had become legendary, earning him the respect of both his allies and his adversaries, including Saladin himself. The two leaders, despite their fierce conflict, developed a grudging mutual admiration, a testament to their shared chivalric ideals. The legacy of the Third Crusade was complex and far-reaching. It marked a shift in the nature of the Crusader states, transforming them from a vast inland kingdom into a series of fortified coastal enclaves. The dream of a unified, expansive Latin East was replaced by a more pragmatic focus on trade, defense, and pilgrimage. The Treaty of Jaffa, while a compromise, established a fragile peace that would last for several years, allowing for a degree of stability and economic recovery in the surviving Crusader territories. However, the fundamental tension remained. Jerusalem, the very heart of the crusading ideal, remained in Muslim hands. This unresolved issue would continue to fuel future crusades and shape the destiny of the Latin East for decades to come. ensuring that the struggle for the Holy Land was far from over. The sun, though setting on the grandest ambitions of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, still cast long shadows over the coastal cities, whispering of past glories and the enduring hope for a return to the Holy City. The fervor that had once swept across Europe, propelling armies to distant lands, began to wane, leaving the Latin East in an increasingly precarious state. The grand expeditions of the Third Crusade, for all their drama and legendary figures, had ultimately failed to reclaim Jerusalem, and the subsequent efforts, though numerous, often felt like echoes of a fading dream. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, now largely confined to a coastal strip, clung to existence like a barnacle on a rock, battered by the tides of regional power. After the departure of Richard the Lionheart, the leadership of the kingdom fell to a succession of figures, each grappling with the immense challenges of a fractured realm. Henry of Champagne, nephew of both Richard and Philip Augustus, became the de facto ruler, marrying Isabella, the Queen of Jerusalem, in a political arrangement that sought to stabilize the crown. His reign, from 1192 to 1197, was marked by a fragile peace with Saladin's brother Al-Adil, who had inherited much of the Ayyubid Empire. This period saw the consolidation of Latin control over cities like Acre, Tyre, and Beirut, but the dream of Jerusalem remained elusive. The kingdom's economy, however, began to adapt, relying heavily on maritime trade, with Italian merchant republics like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa establishing powerful enclaves within the port cities, their warehouses overflowing with silks, spices, and other exotic goods that flowed between East and West. Then came the Fourth Crusade, an expedition that perhaps more than any other illustrates the moral and strategic decay that had begun to plague the crusading ideal. Conceived in 1198 by Pope Innocent III, its initial aim was to strike at the heart of Ayyubid power in Egypt. Yet, through a series of complex financial arrangements and political manipulations, this crusade was diverted, first to Zara, a Christian city on the Adriatic coast, which they sacked in 1202 to pay their Venetian creditors, and then, astonishingly, to Constantinople, the ancient capital of the Byzantine Empire, the very bastion of Eastern Christianity, fell to the Crusaders in 1204, its treasures plundered, its churches desecrated. This act, a brutal betrayal of Christian solidarity, irrevocably deepened the schism between the Latin West and the Orthodox East, a wound that would fester for centuries. The consequences for the Latin East were profound. The Byzantine Empire, a crucial, if often unreliable bulwark against Islamic expansion, was shattered, replaced by a series of fragmented Latin states, none of which offered any real support to the struggling Kingdom of Jerusalem. Indeed, resources and manpower that might have been directed to the Holy Land were instead consumed by the internal struggles of the new Latin Empire of Constantinople. The Fifth Crusade, launched in 1217, represented a renewed attempt to fulfill the original strategy of attacking Egypt. Led by figures like King Andrew II of Hungary and Duke Leopold VI of Austria, and later by Pelagius, the papal legate, this expedition managed to capture Damietta, a key port city at the mouth of the Nile, in 1219. This was a significant achievement, a rare moment of tangible success after years of setbacks. However, the crusade became bogged down in internal disputes and strategic miscalculations. The Crusaders, despite holding a strong bargaining chip, rejected offers from the Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil to exchange Damietta for Jerusalem, believing they could achieve total victory. Their subsequent advance on Cairo in 1221 was a disaster. The Nile's annual flood, combined with the Ayyubid forces' superior knowledge of the terrain, trapped the Crusader army, forcing them to surrender Damietta and retreat in humiliation. This failure underscored a recurring theme: the Crusaders' inability to adapt to the realities of Egyptian warfare and their often unrealistic expectations of swift, decisive victory. Amidst these larger, often ill-fated expeditions, the Kingdom of Jerusalem continued its daily struggle for survival. It was a realm of shifting sands, where alliances were forged and broken with bewildering speed. The Ayyubid dynasty, founded by Saladin, was itself not a monolithic entity. After Saladin's death in 1193, his vast empire was divided among his relatives, leading to internal rivalries and power struggles. This fragmentation occasionally offered opportunities for the Franks, allowing them to play one Ayyubid prince against another. For instance, the Sixth Crusade, often less remembered than its more dramatic predecessors, was led by Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor. Frederick, a complex and controversial figure, was excommunicated by Pope Gregory IX for repeatedly delaying his departure. Yet when he finally arrived in the Holy Land, in 1228, he achieved what no other crusade had managed since the first: the recovery of Jerusalem. This was not through battle, however, but through diplomacy. Frederick, who spoke Arabic and had a keen interest in Islamic culture, negotiated directly with Sultan al-Kamil, Saladin's nephew. Al-Kamil, facing internal threats from his own relatives, was willing to cede Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth, along with a corridor to the coast, in exchange for Frederick's military support against his rivals and a 10-year truce. The Treaty of Jaffa, signed in 1229, was a triumph of pragmatism over religious zeal. However, it was deeply unpopular with many within the Latin East, particularly the Knights Templar and Hospitaller, who viewed Frederick as a heretic and his diplomatic solution as a betrayal of crusading principles. Frederick entered Jerusalem in 1229, but found himself largely isolated, even having to crown himself king in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, as no cleric would perform the ceremony for an excommunicated emperor. This unique episode highlights the growing chasm between the political realities of the Latin East and the increasingly dogmatic views of the papacy and some Crusader factions. The recovery of Jerusalem was, sadly, short-lived. The truce expired in 1239, and the city, largely undefended, was recaptured by the Ayyubids in 1244, this time by a Khwarezmian mercenary force allied with the Ayyubids of Egypt. This final loss of Jerusalem to Muslim control marked a turning point. Though subsequent crusades would be launched, none would ever again succeed in retaking the Holy City. The mid-13th century saw the emergence of a new, formidable power in the Near East, the Mamluks. These were originally Turkic slave soldiers, often purchased as boys and rigorously trained in military arts, who had served the Ayyubid sultans. Over time, their power and influence grew, culminating in a coup in Egypt in 1250. The Mamluks, under their first sultan, Aybak, overthrew the Ayyubid dynasty, establishing their own sultanate that would dominate Egypt and Syria for the next 250 years. Their rise coincided with another cataclysmic event: the Mongol invasions. The Mongol Empire, having swept across Asia, reached the borders of the Islamic world in the 1240s and 1250s, destroying the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad in 1258. The Mongols then turned their attention to Syria, posing an existential threat to both the Ayyubids and the remaining Crusader states. Some Franks, notably the Armenians and some of the smaller Latin lords, sought alliances with the Mongols, hoping to use them as a hammer against their Muslim neighbors. However, the Mamluks, under the brilliant leadership of Sultan Qutuz and later his successor Baybars, proved to be the bulwark against the Mongol tide. In 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut in Galilee, the Mamluks decisively defeated the Mongol army, halting their westward expansion and establishing themselves as the dominant power in the region. This victory was pivotal, not only for the Mamluks, but for the entire Islamic world, and it sealed the fate of the Crusader states, with the Mongol threat contained. The Mamluks turned their full attention to expelling the remaining Franks from the Levant. Sultan Baybars, a ruthless and highly effective military commander, systematically dismantled the Crusader strongholds. He captured Caesarea and Arsuf in 1265, Safed in 1266, and Antioch, the ancient Crusader principality, in 1268, massacring its inhabitants and utterly destroying the city. The fall of Antioch, a city that had stood for 170 years as a symbol of Latin presence, sent shockwaves through Europe. The response from the West was increasingly feeble. Louis IX of France, a devout monarch, launched the Seventh Crusade in 1248, once again targeting Egypt. This expedition, despite Louis's piety and personal courage, ended in disaster. The French king was captured at Mansoura in 1250 and had to be ransomed. He remained in the Holy Land for several years, trying to feudify the remaining Crusader cities, but his efforts were largely in vain. He launched another crusade, the Eighth, in 1270, but this one was diverted to Tunis, where Louis died of dysentery, effectively ending the last major crusading effort by a European monarch. The Mamluk advance continued relentlessly under subsequent sultans. Qalawun, Baybar's successor, captured Tripoli in 1289, ending the county of Tripoli, another of the original Crusader states. The final act came in 1291, with the siege of Acre. Acre, the capital of the truncated Kingdom of Jerusalem since the loss of the Holy City, was the last major Crusader stronghold. It was a bustling port, a hub of trade, and home to a diverse population of Franks, Syrians, and merchants from across the Mediterranean. Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, Qalawun's son, led a massive Mamluk army against the city. The siege was brutal and protracted. Despite a desperate defense by the remaining knights and mercenaries, the city fell on May 18, 1291. The Mamluks systematically destroyed the city, leaving it in ruins to prevent any future Crusader attempts to re-establish a foothold. The fall of Acre marked the definitive end of the Crusader states in the Levant. Though some small outposts like Tortosa and Ruad lingered for a few more years, they too were eventually abandoned or captured. The dream of a permanent Latin presence in the Holy Land, born of the First Crusade, had finally dissolved. What remained were scattered memories, imposing ruins along the coast, and the enduring legacy of a unique historical experiment. Historians still debate the precise reasons for the ultimate failure of the Crusader states. Was it the inherent difficulty of maintaining a distant colonial enterprise against a numerically superior and increasingly unified adversary? Was it the lack of consistent and effective support from Europe, often plagued by its own internal conflicts and shifting priorities? Perhaps the Crusader states, despite their initial military prowess, never truly adapted to the local environment, remaining an alien imposition rather than integrating fully. Or perhaps it was the very nature of their religious zeal, which, while initially powerful, often blinded them to pragmatic solutions and fostered internal divisions. The constant infighting among the various Crusader factions, the military orders, the secular lords, the Italian maritime republics, and the sometimes conflicting authority of the papacy certainly weakened their collective strength. The rise of strong, unified Muslim dynasties like the Ayyubids and especially the Mamluks, with their formidable military organization and strategic acumen, proved to be an insurmountable challenge. The Mamluks, having honed their skills against the Mongols, possessed a military machine far superior to the fragmented and often depleted forces of the Franks. Their scorched earth policy, destroying cities and castles to prevent their reuse, ensured that the Crusader presence was not merely defeated, but eradicated. The legacy of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, however, extended far beyond its physical demise. It left an indelible mark on European consciousness, shaping narratives of heroism, faith, and exotic lands. It fostered significant cultural exchange, not always peaceful, but undeniable. Arabic scientific and philosophical texts, architectural styles, and even culinary practices found their way into Europe through these interactions. Conversely, the Franks left behind their own architectural marvels. Their formidable castles dotting the Levantine landscape, silent witnesses to an era of intense conflict and cross-cultural encounter. The memory of the Crusades continued to resonate, inspiring later generations and influencing geopolitical thought for centuries to come. A complex tapestry woven from faith, ambition, and the enduring human desire for both conquest and connection. The year 1291 dawned with a chilling certainty hanging over Acre, the last bastion of the Crusader kingdom in the Levant. For decades, the city had stood as a defiant, often chaotic, symbol of Western presence, its walls scarred by countless sieges, its harbors perpetually crowded with ships bearing pilgrims, merchants, and soldiers. But now, the Mamluk Sultanate, under the formidable leadership of Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, was preparing its final, overwhelming assault. The fall of Tripoli 2 years prior, in 1289, had sent a clear message. The Mamluks were relentless, their ambition to expel the Franks absolute. Acre, with its triple line of fortifications, its diverse population of Latins, Syrians, and Armenians, and its strategic port, was the ultimate prize. Within the city, a sense of grim foreboding mingled with a desperate hope for relief. The military orders, the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Knights stood ready, their banners still snapping defiantly in the Mediterranean breeze. Yet, their numbers were tragically diminished, a mere shadow of the vast armies that had once marched across these lands. The various European contingents, often at odds with each other even in the face of existential threat, struggled to present a unified front. King Henry II of Cyprus, nominal ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, had arrived with a small force. But it was clear that no grand crusade from Europe was forthcoming. The enthusiasm for such ventures had long since waned, replaced by internal European conflicts and a growing weariness with the immense cost in lives and treasure. On April 5, 1291, the Mamluk army, estimated to be over 100,000 strong, with a siege train boasting some 92 enormous mangonels and trebuchets, began its methodical encirclement of Acre. The sheer scale of the Mamluk force was unprecedented in the history of the Crusades. Their engineers immediately set about constructing massive siege mounds, slowly rising to meet the height of Acre's formidable walls. Day after day, the air was filled with the terrifying thud of massive stones hurled by the Mamluk machines, battering the ancient fortifications. The defenders, though outnumbered, fought with a desperate courage, launching sorties and attempting to sabotage the Mamluk siege engines under the cover of darkness. Yet each successful counterattack was met with overwhelming Mamluk retaliation. One of the most intense points of contention was the Tower of the Legate, a crucial part of the city's defenses, which bore the brunt of the Mamluk assault. For weeks, the Mamluks concentrated their bombardment on this section, weakening the stone and mortar. The defenders, led by the Grand Masters of the military orders, fought valiantly, repairing breaches by night and repelling Mamluk attempts to scale the walls by day. The constant roar of the siege engines, the screams of the wounded, and the acrid smell of dust and blood became the grim soundtrack of Acre's final days. Perhaps the defenders, as they looked out over the vast Mamluk encampment stretching to the horizon, understood that this was not merely another siege, but the closing chapter of an entire era. As the siege wore on, the Mamluks launched a series of devastating attacks. On May 8th, a major assault on the accursed tower, another key defensive point, was repelled, but the Mamluks had managed to undermine parts of the wall. The morale within the city, though still defiant, began to fray. Food and water became scarce, and the constant bombardment took its toll on the civilian population sheltering within the city. Historians still debate the exact number of defenders, but it is generally accepted that there were no more than 15,000 fighting men, including the military orders, compared to the overwhelming Mamluk host. This disparity in numbers made the outcome almost inevitable. On May 18, 1291, Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil ordered a general assault. The Mamluk forces, supported by their powerful siege engines, breached the outer walls in multiple places. Thousands of Mamluk warriors poured into the city, overwhelming the exhausted defenders. The fighting was brutal and chaotic, street by street, house by house. The last stand of the Knights Templar at their heavily fortified headquarters, the Temple Complex, became legendary. Surrounded and outnumbered, they fought to the last man, refusing to surrender. The Grand Master of the Templars, Guillaume de Bourget, was mortally wounded during the fighting, a poignant symbol of the Order's demise in the Holy Land. The fall of Acre was not a swift, clean event, but a prolonged agony. Even after the city walls were breached and much of the city overrun, pockets of resistance continued. The Hospitallers, too, made a desperate stand at their convent, fighting until their positions were untenable. Many civilians attempted to flee by sea, crowding onto any available ship in the harbor, but many more were captured or perished in the chaos. The Mamluks, having achieved their objective, largely massacred the remaining Christian population. A grim testament to the ferocity of the conflict and the Mamluk determination to eradicate the Crusader presence. The city itself was systematically dismantled, its formidable walls and towers razed to prevent any future attempts by the Franks to re-establish a foothold. With the fall of Acre, the last significant territorial possession of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was lost. Though the title of King of Jerusalem would be claimed by various European monarchs for centuries to come, the physical kingdom itself ceased to exist. The remaining Crusader strongholds along the coast, such as Tyre, Sidon, and Beirut, were abandoned or captured in the following weeks and months, their garrisons evacuating by sea. The island of Ruad, a small Templar outpost off the Syrian coast, held out for another decade, falling in 1302 or 1303, marking the absolute final point of sustained Crusader presence in the Levant. The legacy of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was complex and enduring. For nearly 2 centuries, it had been a unique experiment in cross-cultural interaction, a fragile Latin outpost in a predominantly Muslim land. It had seen periods of relative peace and cooperation, particularly in trade and certain aspects of daily life, alongside periods of intense existential warfare. The architecture of the Crusader castles and churches, some of which still stand today, bears witness to the ingenuity and ambition of its builders. The legal codes, known as the Assizes of Jerusalem, reflected a blend of feudal European traditions, adapted to the specific circumstances of the Levant. However, the kingdom was also plagued by internal divisions, dynastic squabbles, and a perpetual struggle for resources and manpower from Europe. The relationship with the local Christian populations, such as the Maronites and Orthodox Christians, was often fraught, despite their shared faith. The Latin rulers frequently struggled to understand or integrate with the diverse indigenous communities, leading to a degree of isolation that ultimately weakened their position. The constant need for crusades from the West, often poorly coordinated and short-lived, meant that the kingdom rarely achieved true stability or self-sufficiency. The end of the Crusader states in the Levant shifted the focus of European ambition, while some, like the Knights Hospitaller, found new homes in places like Rhodes and later Malta, continuing their military and maritime activities. The grand era of direct European military intervention in the Holy Land concluded. The Mamluk victory solidified their control over the Levant, ushering in a period of relative stability under their rule. The memory of the Crusades, however, continued to resonate in both Christian and Muslim worlds, shaping perceptions and narratives for centuries. The echoes of the sieges, the clashes of cultures, and the dreams of a king, dawn in the sun-drenched east, faded into the annals of history, leaving behind only the whispered stories of a time when European knights sought to hold a piece of the Holy Land.